Welcome to Health and Safety Conversations. Here's your host, Tom Bourne.
And joining us today is the wonderful Lisette Kanse.
Dr. Lisette Kanse is a senior lecturer in the School of Psychological Science at the University of Western Australia, UWA, and the course coordinator of UWA's Master of and Graduate Certificate in Business Psychology. She has worked as an academic and as a consultant practitioner in a variety of industrial settings across Europe and Australia, including chemical industry, oil and gas, mining, rail transport, and healthcare settings. Having entered the field of work health and safety over 25 years ago, convinced of the importance of this domain, Lisette's mission across her entire working life has been to improve work environments, either directly or through her students, to keep people safe, healthy, engaged, and productive. Occasionally, she has been known to extend this mission to keeping people safe outside of the work environment as well. She uses her dual background in industrial engineering and organizational psychology to identify and facilitate evidence-based improvements and to warn against ineffective strategies. Her research interests include human factors, work design characteristics, procedures, norms, culture, and leadership, and how these impact on work practice and safety and health.
How are you?
Morning, Tom. I'm well, thank you. How are you today?
Oh, very good for a Saturday, a rainy Saturday. It's been raining an awful lot. I was actually surprised. I thought, I'm waiting for the cancellation because it's been raining so much. So it was an absolute pleasure that you actually came. I kept checking the phone. I kept checking everything to make sure that you hadn't left a message, but it's good to have you here.
I was quite determined to actually make it in person. It is nice to see people in person every now and again with all the things that we're doing virtually these days.
And it's not too disappointing, the house.
That was just lovely. That was one of my other excuses for coming over in person. I had heard you and Karina talk about it.
Yeah.
It must be lovely, and now I'm curious just to satisfy that curiosity, Tom.
Yeah. You're the first person to see the lovely bookcase, and you're also the first person to see the ridiculous qualifications up on the wall. I fought very hard to get them, but yeah, it's been good.
It's nice to have them up there. It's sort of reminding you of all you have gone through to get to the level of knowledge that you're currently at. So, well done for you to know.
Well, yeah, and they are some strange qualifications after all. But anyhow, moving on.
They turned you into the person that you are. I haven't seen to be that along with all the other life.
I was going to say, I'm pretty sure that a lot of that would be scarring that's turned me into the person I am. But anyhow, right. We brought you on to talk about evidence-based practice. So evidence-based practice in the terms or in the context of safety, what does that actually mean?
What does that actually mean? I think I might step back one or two steps to first talk about what evidence-based practice in general is and where it came from. So, even though my discipline that I work in is health, safety, and human factors at work, I do that from a wider discipline that's known as organizational psychology. So I'm not saying I am a psychologist. I haven't had psychology training in Australia, and I've only had exposure to the organizational psychology side of things, so applying psychology in the workplace. But what we have learned from the psychology discipline and what applies not just to psychology or organizational psychology is the importance of evidence-based practice. Originally, it comes from the clinical psychology discipline, and it is all about using what we know from research and the data that we collect in practice. So in clinical psychology, that would be information about your client, about your patient, right, within an organization. That would be data from the organization. Combining all these insights together, looking into what does the scientific evidence say, what might be the most appropriate course of action here for this particular situation, and then apply that, and then obviously come full circle and evaluate as to whether you have actually made a difference, done the right thing, or whether anything needs tweaking. So seeing as safety is a very important part of, managing an organization, using evidence-based practice in implementing safety initiatives is really important. Because even though there might be some approaches that you've heard about or that somebody has been quite loud about or influential about, like, this is the right thing to do and we must be rolling this out everywhere because it is going to make a difference, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to make a difference everywhere and in every setting. And that context is really important. And evidence-based practice in safety or in the wider, organizational space is all about looking for evidence about the context and seeing as to what must that mean or what will that mean for what I have in mind, what, intervention I want to implement, for the initiative I want to implement. Will that be the right thing to do or will that be the right thing to do?
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That probably pops up a few more questions.
Absolutely. Firstly, you talked about organizational psychologists. I've never seen, probably in the last 2 years, a field that is in more demand for people who have an understanding of organizational psychology. And that for a number of reasons, but primarily the focus on now psychosocial hazards and managing and creating a psychologically safe workplace. But, okay, how hard is it to engage with industry and present some sort of research which presents evidence-based practice and get them to take that on board as part of a practice implementing new reforms in the workplace?
The shortest possible answer I can think of, Tom, here is it depends. It depends on who your connection in industry is and what kind of position they bring to that interaction with researchers or organizational psychology practitioners. There are people who have had their own scientific training and whom have been exposed to that idea of how important it is to use scientific evidence as the basis for anything that you do, and who have that research mindset. Let's first find out what is the appropriate thing to do. If you're lucky enough as an academic to meet people like that, when you're trying to make a difference in industry, then it is a bit easier to get them on board and to take them on what is usually a slightly longer journey than just taking something off the shelf. But you were using the example of psychosocial hazards, I should say, and indeed having the legislation that put a bit more of a focus on psychosocial hazards has opened quite a few doors for people with training in organizational psychology. But then often you will get an organization who still wants, like, okay, so tell me, what should I do? Give me the off-the-shelf solution.
Yeah.
But the off-the-shelf solution is not necessarily the best solution for that particular organization. You need to allow your researcher or your person with organizational psychology background time to actually collect more evidence about what is this workplace like, what is the context like, and how does that inform what might be the best approach to psychosocial hazard management in this place. What level are we currently at? What hazards, what specific hazards within that wide range of psychosocial hazards are we experiencing? So sometimes it can be an incredibly rewarding experience when you do get an organization that understands the value of, but we must have evidence and we cannot just implement something off the shelf and hope for the best. And sometimes it can be a bit difficult or more frustrating when you're interacting with organizations that still need to be taken on that journey of it. But science is important, and what we know from research is important, but also we need to know whether that matches the context in which you're operating.
So when you talk about off-the-shelf practices or things that we might implement. Would you suggest that there's no silver bullets to solving issues in the workplace safety field?
I think there are solutions that time and time again have shown their effectiveness. These solutions still, in my view, benefit from tailoring to where you want to implement them and when you want to implement them.
Okay.
Because there's still the people, the group of workers that you're working with in that context. So yes, there are approaches that have been shown to be effective, and particularly for certain settings, but tailoring, collecting that local evidence and making sure that you adjust to that is still, in my book, super important.
Good. In your experience dealing with both safety folk and their employers or PCBUs, are they traditionally reactive in terms of when an incident or an accident or a situation arises that they just want a solution to implement immediately without having to do the hard work and actually try and understand the situation?
The safety folk that I have had the pleasure of working with here in Western Australia have not been in that camp. I think the safety profession as a whole, but from what I've learned since coming to Australia, particularly also in Australia, has moved beyond that reactive approach and taken a more proactive and also a science-based approach. We have with the Australian Institute of Health and Safety, both you and I quite involved with. We have the OHS body of knowledge for safety professionals. There's a really strong evidence base in that body of knowledge, and I see a lot of engagement among safety professionals with that knowledge. And also encouragingly, if safety professionals know that there's something that can be done in a particular space, but they don't have the knowledge themselves, that they're willing to reach out to people that do have that knowledge and that can help.
Good. Right. Fairly basic question. What's some of the risks that you can see on relying on anecdotal or what some leaders might say is intuitive decision-based decision-making rather than actually relying on research-based evidence?
I think the biggest risk is that you end up implementing something that's not effective in achieving the targeted outcome, but in sort of a financial sense, then also not cost effective. And I think with the advent of generative AI, it's incredibly easy to ask Gen AI, this is my problem situation, give them a short description, if a description at all, right? It might just be a general label of, okay, this is the issue. You will get a response because that's what Gen AI is really good at.
Yes.
And then without further probing, without further identifying how credible is the source that the Gen AI based is on, implementing that, I think there's risks involved in that.
Absolutely. I used AI quite a bit. I'll be quite honest. I was very slow to take it up originally, but then I see overwhelmingly its benefits. But
I agree with you on that one. And it can make us so much more productive. And for getting a general lay of the land, it is really good. It's a very good starting point.
Yeah.
And language-wise, especially if, you're not a first language speaker, it is incredibly helpful in that sense. But we do need to maintain our own curiosity, and we do need to maintain sort of critical lens. But does that actually make sense? And how true is this?
That's what I found. I found the amount of times it's actually presented things to me as truth, and on a surface scan, you go, "Oh, that's great, that's awesome." But if you actually dig a little bit deeper, you go, "That is factually incorrect." That is
Or based on slightly dated information as well, depending on whether you go with free models or whether you go with the paid model.
yes.
I think it's up to date until 2021, and we're 4 years down the track now. We might have, gained insights you would like to think within the last 4 years that are important.
Maybe. Maybe. I just on that, and it's disappearing down the AI rabbit hole. Is there a danger that we will lose some, at least in your opinion, some of our critical thinking ability or our creative process by becoming reliant on AI regurgitating already thought up and established information?
I think you're right, both in the creativity sense as well as in the critical thinking sense. But I think there are things I'd like to be optimistic about these things, as in doomsday thinking is not going to help any of us. But if we instill, and I think from a young age onward, from school age onward, but definitely for people like myself in university, we have a role to play, and in any education institution, a role to play in teaching people that digital literacy, so that they know what they can do to continue to be a critical thinker and collaborate in that sense with Gen AI, rather than sort of letting it take over and letting it do all the thinking for themselves. And you can ask critical questions of AI and get more considered answers back. But if we don't teach people that skill, it's incredibly easy to all go towards a more generic approach towards things, as we let us be guided more and more by Gen AI.
I was speaking to the wonderful gentleman, Professor Nectarius Karanicus, in the Gold Coast, the AIHS conference, and we somehow stumbled on to talking about AI, and his point of view was it's not artificial and it's not intelligence, being that it's simply a regurgitation of existing ideas and information. So it's like a database, and the quality of information it gives you depends purely on the instructions or the clarity of the instructions that the user gives it. And his point,
That's very true, I agree.
his point is, he said, you have to think of it more like a slave. And I was curious. I was like, a slave? He said, well, a slave wants to please its master. So does generative AI. So if you don't make your instructions explicit as to what you require, it will fill in the gaps with what it thinks you want to hear. Now, that might not be accurate information, but it's information that it thinks or it assumes that you would like to hear. And that's a bit interesting for me, because the idea is that if we don't give it complete instructions, that it is just
Filling in the gap.
filling in the gaps, is kind of scary. It's a whole thing that you could actually end up with a lot of confirmation bias being reinforced by generative AI, but it's interesting.
Good point with regard to that confirmation bias. It is interesting, and we do need to stay alert. It's a good thing, and I don't like the word play, but it is an assist. Right?
Yes. It also, I guess it would also come into the field of also maybe bringing in anchoring bias, that the first information you had would seem more relevant than any subsequent information to the contrary. But it's far above my thought pattern.
If you have a spare evening, you can hold an entire conversation about how AI work with AI. It's interesting. And before you know it, hours will have passed. It did tell me in conversations that I have had over recent months that but if you work with a free version, obviously at the moment, it only remembers within the conversation. It does not remember previous conversations. So even if you think that it might be starting to get to know you, it doesn't do that unless you paste in the text from the previous conversation.
Yes. All right. Just the last question I'll do on AI, because I think we've disappeared down that rabbit hole. How hard is it, or what's some of the challenges that a lecturer, someone working in university has in this day and age with students using generative AI instead of presenting original material they may have thought of? Is it much more challenging field than it was, say, 10 years ago?
I think of it as there are different challenges now, and definitely a great importance for people in an education environment to stay with the times. If you don't, there's a risk. Well, I think it's more than a risk. I think in many cases already that students know better how to cleverly use AI. So you need to educate yourself. But the good news with academics, we're lifelong learners, right? So once we're sort of accepting that this is better complete is going to be around, educate ourselves, and then I think our role turns into I think it's impossible to stay on the longer run. Like you can't use AI, but more to make whoever is training with us a more critical consumer of that. We give people that digital literacy, that skill set to be asking the questions and rephrasing the questions and not taking everything that comes out as a response for granted. So sort of incorporate it in our training rather than trying to push back on it.
Yeah.
That horse has bolted and so we're needing to adjust. So it is challenging, but I think it's an interesting challenge. I think it's not all negative. I know I will have colleagues who go, this is a problem, I have no idea what to do, but we keep learning. So that's what we should do. Keep learning about this and how to incorporate in a good way.
I know in my much lower level teaching that students will come up to me quite often with their laptop to ask me about this or ask me about that. And I find it highly unusual these days that I don't see a tab on their laptop where they've got some sort of either ChatGPT or Copilot open to help guide them through the thing. And probably the first few times I saw it, I got a little old-fashioned narky, and then I'll just become accepting because there is no pushback. You cannot put that genie back in the bottle, and we will have to just learn to live with it. But, all right, just from your research and teaching, some of the biggest myths you've seen about safety culture.
First, the biggest myths about it depends on who's the holder of the myth.
True.
I think let's turn it into issues around safety culture. There are managers who believe that this is something that is easy to change, and that there is, you use the word silver bullet, big word, that there is a silver bullet. There's one thing or a couple of things that we can do to improve safety culture. And yes, there are things that we can do to improve, but it's a long process.
Yes.
For me to be seen walking the talk, not talking the talk. I mean, super easy to encounter setbacks, and then you start hurrying back probably even further than you were before the setback happens. So I think a big misunderstanding around safety culture is that we can change this overnight.
Yep.
We can't. But that's not to say let's give up on trying to improve safety culture or safety climate altogether. But we need to understand it's a process, and there's many steps along the way, and many people need to be involved.
Yeah. From me teaching again at a lower level, when we teach students about investigations and they go through the process, one of the disappointing things for me is usually when we try and isolate the primary reason, I don't really want to say root cause of it, but students usually come up with the idea of it's either the worker that's to blame, and surprisingly, and I'm quite happy, that seems to be now becoming more of a minority, but it still stands out quite significantly when it does.
That's a good teaching opportunity for you.
It's a matter of how much time can I spend on this to say, let's just rethink that. Or they'll come up with this grand statement, it's lack of safety culture or it's poor safety culture. And it's a great throwaway line, poor safety culture. And you go,
But what are you going to do?
yeah, what does that actually mean though? How are you going to improve that? Because we're going to improve safety culture without any further thought, to me, is just a throwaway line. It's ending an investigation with no improvement. It's a destination without a roadmap. So that's some of the interesting things I've seen. And there are the fact that we have practitioners that say there is no such thing as safety culture, or safety culture is part of a subset of business culture. And you've got some people who very strongly come out and say safety culture is its own subset of values, and that makes it difficult to actually teach students. But I do try and suggest to them that they put it in their own context. And actually, it's a throwaway line from the X-Files, but I say, just question everything. I don't want you to walk away from my classes parroting what I say. I don't want you to look up things and you hear about this model or that model and you just parrot it without thinking. I think that's the danger in safety, that we have too many people that latch onto ideas and it's almost like rote learning. So that's some of the issues.
And the ideas that get advocated the most loudly are the ones that get more taken up.
Oh,
But
absolutely.
I like what you're telling your students, and you just have to keep asking questions. That investigative mindset, right? That's what we do with research as well, right? Just keep asking and find your own evidence, and potentially asking the students that do arrive at, but safety culture played a role here. Get them to drill deep.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by safety culture, and why would you say it's not necessarily a bad finding, but just like we're teaching our students in incident investigation that if there was a human error, that's the starting point of the investigation, not the end point. Maybe with safety culture or safety climate, that's also the starting point of the, but what does that actually look like in this particular work setting? And what factors contributed to that culture being prevalent? And can we start tapping into those?
Good. Can you give an example where you've had strong, or you've seen strong evidence-based research suggesting something, but it's clearly contradicting a widely practiced safety process in the field? We've got clear evidence saying this is the way, yet we've got a group of safety practitioners that have, over time, practiced something completely different, which isn't based on the evidence.
The example that I needed to think about this for a bit, but the example that comes to mind first is around a compliance-based approach to safety. What is, in a way, a comforting approach for management, because if you seem to be compliant with, rules and procedures that are in place to control, behaviors and ensure particular outcomes, then we have done the right thing, is thinking. But you can't possibly foresee all possible scenarios that workers will encounter in high-risk environments. So, by necessity, your rule books, your procedure manuals won't cover everything, or if they do cover something, there might be something in that particular given context that makes those procedures unworkable. And evidence, I was working in how to improve usability of procedures and use the end user approach towards developing them. I think 25 years ago when I first started working in safety. We were making differences there, but you do that at a very localized, just with, the plants that you work with. And nowadays, you enter new organizations and that same problem is still there, that no, we must ensure compliance, and compliance is the ultimate goal to work towards in safety. So I think that's where the evidence over years continues to point in another direction. And I'm not saying that everybody with safety responsibilities does go down that compliance way, but it is still a much used approach.
Is that partly because of the reactive legal processes we have in place, whereas compliance to meeting obligations, standards, etc., is seen as protecting yourself legally?
I'm sure that's a big part of it. This is a conversation, if you haven't yet had, you can have it, Greg Smith.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. How do we get complex research-based findings and translate them in simple terms that can be used within workplaces?
I think that actually, coming back to the Gen AI, that's where Gen AI can actually help people make sense of what might otherwise be seen as this is very complex scientific way of talking. You're talking maybe about scientific publications that are written in academic style language, but what does that mean in practice? So there's a place there. There's a place in when we get people come through our education institutions to equip them better to make sense of scientific research and the way it's written up. There's a formula to it. And if people see through that formula, they know what parts they need to be looking at in a scientific paper to make sense of it. And to equip people with, not everybody loves math, but at least an appreciation of the different statistical data analysis techniques that are out there. And if people, that's a path that I just can't go down. Then help them to identify people who can help in that space, right? So that people can distinguish between this was good quality research, this was bad quality research, and hence pick those publications that, okay, this is done properly, and then in those publications look for practical implications. I know in the field that I publish in, obviously you're meant to include, okay, these are the scientific contributions that my work made, but because research is so applied in organizational settings, at a general organizational, safety-specific organization. So what does this mean for practitioners in the field? Yeah. And over time, I think researchers have been getting better at also putting those at the back end in their scientific papers. So look in the discussion area and look for practical implications there. That's one place to start. And then in our training of our students, because not everybody stays in academia. Right? I already didn't stay in academia either, right? Been out in industry before going back. Give them those skills to actually read those papers, to look in those papers for where do I find the practical implications, and look in those papers for signs that this was good quality research. So therefore, these practical implications do matter. I can take them on board. I can trust them. And how to then communicate that in layperson's language. Some people are naturally good at that, and otherwise grab what is written there in academic language and paste it into your generative AI and help them translate. How do I say this in lay people's language?
Very good, very good. Right. You talked about background in human factors, and that's part of your teaching. Going to ask something that's probably a little controversial, but why not? Okay. Human factors in the academic sense. Do you see somewhat separation from what we see being offered to industry in things like HOP programs, for example, where they seem to be highly commercialized, as opposed to human factors, the basis that gets taught in universities?
Certainly. I think the human factors that gets taught in universities has a much more central focus on research and on evidence from research in the output and the findings that they produce.
Good. All right. How well is human factors being integrated into safety thinking and training today, in your opinion?
Whatever I'm going to say is necessarily biased by what I have been able to see, and I'm well aware that I have not been able to be, everywhere. I think we have seen more of an understanding in work health and safety of human factors. I think there's still ways to go. You were saying human factors and sort of the research people that do human factors. And in general, academics, we're not all necessarily good at communicating outside of our field. So I think there's still some work to be done for human factors researchers to engage more with industry, to engage more with practitioners.
Good. All right. What's your current view of safety training? Okay. Are we actually, in general, and again, this will be basically an opinion based on your experience, how well are we actually equipping our people to be critical thinkers?
That's a good question to ask any safety training provider. That's a question I could be asking you.
Well,
You can be asking me. Of course, I teach in organizational psychology and in business psychology. I do have classes that are all about work health and safety and human factors, but I don't teach an entire program that trains people like a master of work health and safety to become a safety professional. So you should be talking to people who teach those programs. But just talking to the programs that I am involved in, we do try to equip people to be lifelong learners, to really value that scientist practitioner model. We base what we do on findings from research. We value research. We know how to do research, and to be a critical thinker and a critical consumer of other research, so that they can look at it and judge the credibility of what is written there. Was this done in a proper way, or was this not done with, the right research techniques? So that's what we do in the programs that I teach in. I haven't been involved in accreditation of other programs, so looking beyond the programs that I teach in. I think that's a difficult question for me to answer. But what do you find? You worked for several training providers.
Look, for me, and again, obviously it's biased because of my experiences.
That applies to both of us.
There is, I would suggest it's not embedded in the curriculum at all. I would suggest it's highly dependent on the person who is doing the teaching. And I would also say it's highly dependent on the amount of time you're given to actually get ideas across. Obviously, the more intensive programs, we lose an awful lot of opportunities to teach people how to think, because we're too busy ticking boxes,
getting content,
and basically ticking boxes as part of an accredited program, as opposed to giving people the time to deeply reflect on things and make up their own mind, or even to do some more in-depth research that will help form their opinions of something. I just don't think, at least in the situations I've seen, we have the time to do that. And part of that is, a lot of people will say, well, that's part of the education system, and particularly the vocational education system. But I'd say, yes, there's a certain amount of truth in that, but I'd also push back on it and say, this is what the consumer actually wants. The consumer wants to achieve their goals in as short a time as possible. And that's just a little disappointing sometimes, because you feel like you could give so much more and you could help them think so much better, and you could give the breadth and depth of your experience and knowledge, but you just don't have that opportunity to
You don't have the time within how many hours of
training. Yep.
You have to deliver to them.
So I think it's a problem, but I think it's not a simple solution. It's not a provider necessarily being the sausage machine where they just push students out unprepared. I also think it's consumer driven as well. So
there's factors on all sides that have led to this fail. And I think that's where our educational models differ quite substantially. If I get students into just one unit, a course on a particular topic, I have them for 13 weeks, right? I have them for 150 hours of engagement. Not that I'm talking to them for all of the 150 hours. Lord, that would be all sorts of wrong. But there's an opportunity there. But if you only have like a 2-day training to deliver, how are you going to have? And especially if these 2 days are back to back.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there might be an opportunity. And then it depends indeed on the trainer who sort of finds the opportunities to weave in this focus on critical thinking. If you send them back to work between day 1 of training and day 2 of training with, I would almost like to say, homework, right?
Yes.
It's a very high school way of talking about things. But do this when you're in the, you can have them reflect outside of the time that they're at the training venue. And then by the second time you get them the second day, there's an opportunity to maybe focus on some of the learnings and the reflections that they have done. But if it's just one block of training without time in between, it's going to be infinitely harder, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, the last question. If you could give one piece of advice to safety professionals to help them make better decisions based on evidence-based information, what would it be?
One bit of advice. This is shaped in part by what you mentioned to me before, right? Organizational psychologists having valuable knowledge in that space of the psychosocial hazards. And I'm finding with safety professionals that I talk to nowadays, it's part of my remit, or it might be part of HR, or it's a bit of both, but whoever claims the ownership. I would recommend safety professionals to engage with people with training in organizational psychology. They can help in that space. They have access to that knowledge base. They know about evidence-based practice. So that would be my bit of advice. And have a conversation with the people in the HR team. I think there's a bit of unclarity as to who owns this area. And there might be parallel approaches without the often quite siloed disciplines talking to each other.
Yeah.
It would be so much better if there was that conversation.
Absolutely.
So that was 2 bits of advice. Sorry, I snuck that other one in. But
That's all right. I think the HR and safety issue is a whole separate conversation where you could talk about it for a long period of time.
I could connect you with other people on this stuff because
I've had some differing opinions, and I've had my own strong opinion on that, but I had a very smart gentleman basically school me on it, and we might save that for another conversation. Lisette, it's always a pleasure, as you know, talking to you. And you're always welcome to come and have a chat to us because you add so much value to the safety industry, and I'm sure the whole of the community, the safety community, at least in Western Australia, realise the impact that you actually have in helping shape future professionals. So thank you, but for now we're going to have to leave it there.
Thank you for the opportunity, Tom, and it's always a pleasure talking to you as well. Happy to come back anytime.
Thanks for listening to Health and Safety Conversations with Tom Bourne. Until next time, stay safe and enjoy the rest of your week.